Good afternoon, everybody. Today we'll be discussing hemorrhage and arrest of bleeding, that is controlling bleeding, which is hemostasis. So we'll have hemorrhage and hemostasis. Yeah. What is the problem with hemorrhage? As you all know, hemorrhage leads to blood loss, isn't it? Which finally gives rise to shock, which can end in death if not treated properly and at the correct time. Now, treatment has two components. One is controlling the bleeding, which is the primary aim, and secondly, we have to resuscitate the patient. So both of these take place simultaneously. That is, while you are resuscitating, you try to control the bleeding. If you don't control bleeding, it's like trying to pour water into a leaking pot, isn't it? So we have to, yeah. Now, coming to the pathophysiology of hemorrhage. Hemorrhage gives rise to hypovolemic shock, which is probably the commonest type of shock which is encountered by a surgeon. This hypovolemic shock in turn gives rise to cellular anaerobic metabolism, which leads to lactic acidosis. This lactic acidosis will give rise to coagulopathy. Now, coagulopathy in the presence of hemorrhage will give rise to further hemorrhage, isn't it? Besides this, it also gives rise to ischemic cell damage, which again activates anticoagulant pathways. So, yeah, so they're all interdependent and sort of a vicious cycle. Now, reduced perfusion to tissues gives rise to reduced blood supply to the gut and the muscle, because the body tries to conserve whatever blood is there by limiting the supply to the gut and the muscle, which are not essential for life. All right. Now, what happens when there is a reduced blood supply to the muscle? There is reduced muscle action, which reduces the production of heat. So this gives rise to hypothermia. How do we generate heat when we are in cold weather or when it's cold? By shivering or by muscle action, isn't it? So when there is reduced blood supply, when in shock, there is reduced supply to the muscle, which in turn gives rise to reduced muscular activity, which gives rise to hypothermia. So now we have acidosis, we have coagulopathy, and we have hypothermia. Now this hypothermia further produces coagulation problems. So now this is becoming a big vicious cycle. So one feeds on the other and all together produces a spiral of death. This is what we have. So hypothermia is one thing that is produced by hemorrhage and shock. The other thing that is produced by hemorrhage and shock is acidosis. And the third problem that we have is coagulopathy. Now these are all interdependent. One gives rise to the other. This gives rise to this. This gives rise to this. This gives rise to this. So this gives rise to this, and so all of them are interdependent. It's a vicious cycle. So that is the problem. This finally leads to death. So we are what our aim is: one, to control the bleeding; two, to get the patient out of these three problems that the patient has. So we must correct the hypothermia, we must correct the acidosis, we must correct the coagulopathy. So the first thing that you will do when you have a patient with hemorrhage is obviously try to control the bleed. Along with that, you will try to resuscitate the patient. Now this involves giving IV fluids. Now, while you're treating the patient with IV fluids and blood and all that, there are various other problems that can arise, which can exacerbate the already existing problems. You understand? Now, IV fluids, as all of you probably in tropical countries like India, especially in South India probably, the fluid is stored at room temperature, it might not be such a problem. But in cold countries, if the fluid is stored at room temperature, or when you have fluid stored in the operation theater where you have an air conditioner working, the temperature is lower than the body temperature. So if you infuse this fluid into the patient, you will have hypothermia. Similarly, blood, as all of you know, stored blood is stored at a very low temperature. So you have to rewarm the blood before you give it to the patient. Otherwise, these fluids itself can produce hypothermia, which is already one of the problems we are facing. The other problem is crystalloid fluids are acidic in nature. So when you transfuse or when we give these patients IV fluids, we are making the patient more acidic. So of the three problems that we were talking about, that is hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy, we are exacerbating the acidotic limb of the problem. The third problem you have when you're trying to control the hemorrhage is you're opening up body cavities. For example, if you have a patient with a splenic rupture, you have to do a laparotomy and then remove the spleen or do a splenography or something like that. So again, when you open the abdomen, you are exposing more of the body surface area to the ambient temperature, isn't it? Which can again lower the temperature of the core temperature of the body, giving rise to hypothermia. So these are some problems that you face when you are treating a patient with hemorrhage. Yeah. Now coming to some theoretical aspects of this. Types of hemorrhage. Obviously, any classification helps you in trying to understand the problem and in managing the problem, isn't it? So types of hemorrhage can be divided into revealed hemorrhage and concealed hemorrhage. What do we mean by revealed hemorrhage? As the name implies, hemorrhage that you can see. For example, you cut your finger when handling a knife while cooking. It is revealed hemorrhage. You can see the bleeding and you can see the site of the bleeding. Hematemesis or epistaxis are also types of revealed hemorrhage. That is, you know that there is bleeding because you can see the blood. The problem with these, with epistaxis, hematemesis, you don't know the exact site of the bleed. Probably epistaxis will tell you the bleeding is somewhere from the nasal cavity or the paranasal sinuses, or hematemesis will tell you that the bleeding is from the GI tract. But the exact site of bleeding may not be seen. That is one problem with these. Then you can have bleeding from the anal canal. You can have bleeding PR. Again, you know that there is bleeding because you're seeing, or the patient is seeing blood being passed. But the exact site you will have to locate. That is revealed hemorrhage. Coming to concealed hemorrhage, the patient is losing blood, but you cannot see. The patient or the examiner cannot see the blood. It is in an area which cannot be seen. That is what we mean by concealed hemorrhage. So if you have a hemothorax, the patient has had an RTA and the patient is bleeding into the thorax. Externally, there is no blood. That is what is called concealed hemorrhage. Or into the abdomen. Again, like I was talking about the ruptured spleen earlier, patient has had an RTA or a fall from a height. He has a blunt injury of the abdomen. That is, outside there is no blood, but the spleen is ruptured and he is bleeding profusely into the peritoneal cavity. That's another type of concealed hemorrhage. Like that it goes on. Cranial injury, for example, RTA again. The patient has an extradural hematoma. Again, there is bleeding into the extradural space, which cannot be seen from outside. You understand? These are all examples of concealed hemorrhage. Bowel, like that, you can, any number of examples you can give. The other way of classifying hemorrhages, so this is concealed hemorrhage. The other ways, you can have primary hemorrhage, you can have reactionary hemorrhage, and you can have secondary hemorrhage. Now, what do we mean by primary hemorrhage? Primary hemorrhage is the hemorrhage produced by the trauma or the injury. So, like I was telling you again, if you cut your hand and you have bleeding, that's primary hemorrhage. You can see it. So this is hemorrhage that takes place immediately. Or during surgery, when you're doing an operation, you're doing a surgery, you cut a vessel, you have primary hemorrhage. So the immediate treatment for this is to control the bleeding. Either in the case of the finger, you can probably apply pressure. During surgery, if there is bleeding, you can either use a ligature or you can use a cautery to control the bleeding. This is what we mean by primary hemorrhage. The next thing is reactionary hemorrhage. Now what happens is you are doing surgery. You have primary hemorrhage, you cut a vessel, you ligate the vessel or you cauterize the vessel and the patient is fine. Then the patient is sent to the intensive care unit or to the ward. Within 24 hours, again the patient develops hemorrhage from the same site. This is called reactionary hemorrhage. Now the reason for this is, there are various reasons. So some of the reasons are increase in the BP. While you are doing the surgery, the patient is probably, you've done it under spinal anesthesia, where the BP is probably at a lower level than the normal BP of the patient. Or under GA, the patient is under hypotensive anesthesia. Again, the BP is maintained at lower level. Once the patient recovers, the BP will go up to his normal value, isn't it? So that increase in the BP might dislodge the clot, which has controlled the bleeding. Small vessels stop bleeding without your doing anything to control the bleeding. Because of vasoconstriction and the formation of a clot, the bleeding stops. But once the patient recovers and the BP goes up, there is an increase in the pressure in that vessel, which will dislodge the clot. That is one mechanism. The other mechanism is, like I told you, you control the bleeding by using a ligature. Again, this ligature might slip, or you cauterize it. This might give way. This can produce hemorrhage. This is what we mean by reactionary hemorrhage. So hemorrhage which appears within 24 hours of the surgery is called reactionary hemorrhage, and these are the probable causes. So in these cases, you will have to go in again and try and control the bleeding again. You'll have to ligate the vessel or recauterize it, or do something to control the bleeding again. Then we have what is called secondary hemorrhage. You know what happens in secondary hemorrhage is after 24 hours, usually within the first 1 week after surgery, either because of an infection or because of the pressure necrosis in that area. That is, you have tied a ligature and because of the pressure there, or you have sutured the abdominal wall and because of the pressure there, the blood vessel sloughs off. Either there is a secondary infection that develops or because of the pressure. And this usually takes place within 7 to 14 days after the surgery. You understand? So this is called secondary hemorrhage. So what will you do here? You will have to control the infection. So you'll have to give antibiotics, control the infection. You can try to apply pressure locally, and if it's because of pressure necrosis, you'll have to either remove the sutures or something like that to relieve the pressure. So here basically it's usually controlling infection because that is usually the primary initiating factor. So you will give antibiotics, control the infection, and then you will try to control the bleeding by either direct intervention or by pressure. So this is about primary, reactionary and secondary hemorrhage. So this is after surgery usually. Then depending upon the pathology of the bleeding, you can classify it into surgical and non-surgical causes of hemorrhage. Now what do we mean by surgical causes? Again, like I told you, direct injury or a fall or a trauma, blunt trauma, anything. Injury which produces bleeding. Now what is the good point about this? The good point about surgical hemorrhages, you can control that bleeding by either cautery or ligature or compression, something like that. You understand? So once the bleeding is stopped, the patient will recover. This is the thing about surgical hemorrhage. Now we have non-surgical hemorrhage. Now non-surgical hemorrhage is due to coagulopathies. So you have some blood problems either like hemophilia or dengue or sometimes an end stage of shock. So here the problem is it is not controlling the vessel will not stop the bleeding. You have to control the coagulopathy. So this is a medical problem, that in the sense that hemophilia, you have to treat the hemophilia by giving factor VIII. Dengue, you have to treat the infection by some shock, you have to control the shock. That only then will you be able to control the bleeding. Unlike surgical hemorrhage where you can tie it, you can cauterize it, you can compress it, stop the bleeding. But here you have to control the problem in the blood. That is what we mean by non-surgical bleeding. So it requires a lot of, besides surgical techniques, you require correction of the coagulopathy. Yeah. So this is how you classify various ways of classifying hemorrhage. Then, see, you must have some idea about the blood volume. This is physiology, which all of you have studied, but I'm just going through it quickly. Normally, we say that an adult patient has about 5 liters of blood. If you want to be more accurate, there is 70 ml per kg in adults and in children. In neonates and infants, the volume it's 80 ml per kg. So they have more blood volume compared to their weight. So any loss in this is what we call hemorrhage, isn't it? Now, how will you assess the quantity of blood loss? This is not always very easy. So now, for example, patient has had a trauma on the road traffic accident. Patient is brought to you. You can see there is bleeding. The patient also has internal bleeding. Not easy to measure the blood loss, isn't it? There are various indirect ways of doing it, but it's not always easy. Now, during surgery, probably one way of assessing blood loss during surgery, I'm talking about, is you have a suction and you can measure the quantity of blood that has come into that suction. That is one way. Or you use mops to control the bleeding, you know. So you weigh the mop before the surgery and then you weigh the mop after the surgery. And also, as all of you know, specific gravity of blood is almost the same as water, which is 1. So each ml of blood will be 1 gram. So the mop weighed 100 grams before the surgery and weighs 200 grams now. The weight difference is 100 grams, which means there is 100 ml of blood. You understand? Very easy. Yeah. The other indirect method of measuring blood is, like I was talking to you about road traffic accident, you can look at the hemoglobin level. Now, this is not very accurate. Now, the problem with this is, see, immediately after hemorrhage or trauma, what happens is there is hemoconcentration. That is to say, there is blood loss. and then the the HB will show a higher value than normal because of the hemo concentration. Similarly, the packed cells will show a higher value. PCV will, or the hematocrit will show you a higher value. Later on, as the body adjusts, what happens is the fluid from the extracellular space will, from the, extravascular space will go into the blood to build up the intravascular space. So then it will reach a normal, and then later on there will be a drop again. Just think over it. So the HB and the PCV will drop only after some time following the hemorrhage. Immediately or after the hemorrhage, it may show an increase or it will be normal. So later on, the drop comes only after some time. So the time when you measure the HB and the PCV is important to give to tell you whether there is a drop or not. So initially I told you it will be normal, later on it will drop. That drop is what will tell you what the actual state is. You understand? So say 2 hours after the hemorrhage, the patient will, the HB will drop to say 11, and the PCV will drop to 33, or the hematocrit will drop to 33. That is actually the correct situation. The early readings that you got were normal, but they are false because it is because of hemoconcentration. Yeah. So one way of classifying hemorrhages, another way of looking at it is the degrees of hemorrhage. Now there are various classes that we have. So class 1 is 15%, which means 15% of 5 liters will be around 1500 ml. 750 ml. 750 ml. Then class 2 is 15 to 30%, which is from 750 to 1500 ml. Class 3 is 30% to 40%, which is 1500 to 2000 ml. And class 4 is more than 40%, which is more than 2000 ml. I'm talking about a patient with 5 liters of blood in the body initially. Now this is useful to give you an idea as to how to treat the patient, you understand? So if you say a class 1 hemorrhage, you will know that the patient has lost about 750 ml, so you have to correct it. 1000, like that, you know. So each class will tell you the quantity of blood loss, so we can correct it accordingly. Now this is not always sufficient to treat a patient. The reason is there are various other physiological changes that take place, you understand, depending upon the age, the physique of the patient, the comorbidities and pain. Now I'll take each of these separately. Yeah. We'll take age. As you all know, elderly people, their blood vessels are either thickened, and they will not always react to stimuli as a young adult will react to it. So, for example, the vasoconstricting mechanism in an elderly patient is not as good as it is in a young patient. So, say a 25-year-old male who is who works physically, or who has good, whose physical characteristics are good, he will be able to tolerate hemorrhage of say 15 or even up to 30% without too many problems. In fact, you might find that his BP is normal, his pulse rate is normal. An athlete, for example, even though he has lost 15% of blood or even up to 30% of blood. Whereas an elderly patient, because his body cannot react, vasoconstriction is poor, he can not produce catecholamines, well, that lot of problem, may not respond to the same amount of hemorrhage as well. So you will find that if he has even a 15% hemorrhage or a 750 ml loss of blood, his pulse rate will go up, his BP might drop, and he'll have all sorts of other problems. So that is about age and the physique. Then coming to comorbidities. One thing, obviously, if the patient has diabetes or cardiac problems or hypertension, the body will not react as well to a hemorrhage as you would get in a young patient without any comorbidities. The other problem is these patients will be taking medications for their various illnesses. For example, hypertension, the patient might be on beta blockers. Now, as all of you know, beta blockers reduces the pulse rate. So though the patient has a bleeding hemorrhage of 30%, he has lost 1500 ml of blood, his pulse rate may not go up correspondingly. You understand the problem? Yeah, so like that. So comorbidities, besides the comorbidity, the medication that the patient is on for the comorbidities alters the findings. Yeah. Pain, as you all know, is a protective mechanism. So it is a stimulant, you know. So pain in itself can reduce the reaction of the body to the loss of blood. So that is another factor that you have to consider. So what I'm trying to say is it is not just sufficient to look at the quantity of blood loss. You must assess, you must take into consideration the age of the patient, the physique of the patient, the comorbidities the patient has, the medication that the patients are taking for the comorbidities, and the pain stimulus. Yeah. Anyway, taking all these factors into consideration, that is the quantity of blood loss, the site of the blood loss, the various, whether it is surgical or non-surgical, and all those other factors we just now talked about, age, physique, comorbidities and all that, we have to treat the patient. So besides considering all the other things, are, what should I say, the first thing that we would like to do is we would like to consider is the degree of shock or the degree of blood loss. You understand? For this, you must have an idea of the preload. So if the preload is normal, which probably the body will adjust to for some time to the blood loss. Then afterwards, obviously, the patient will go into shock. That's what I was talking to you just now about age and physique and all that. So we have to correct the preload, isn't it? So once there is bleeding, preload after some time will come down. So we have to correct that. Base deficit, that is, I told you the patients will go into acidotic shock, or there will be a degree of acidosis. So for that, we have to correct the base deficit. The third thing that we can base our treatment, so base deficit is what when you do an arterial blood gas analysis, you can calculate the base deficit. It will tell you the amount of hemorrhage and probably the amount of correction that is required. So yeah. And finally, you have what is called the dynamic response to fluid therapy. So depending on the amount of blood loss, that is what we mean by degree of hypovolemic shock, then the preload, you assess the preload and you assess the base deficit. You try to correct all these. The simplest probably way of finding out whether the patient is bleeding, continuing to bleed or not, is by doing the dynamic response to fluid therapy. Here what you do is you load the patient with about 250 to 500 ml of fluid in about half an hour. You give the fluid rapidly, and then you see whether the CVP, not only the CVP, but the BP, the pulse rate, everything is responding to this fluid. So you would expect the CVP to go up by about 2 to 5 centimeters. CVP is a central venous pressure, all right, which is measured. It is telling you the pressure in the right atrium. So that is preload, isn't it? That tells you the preload. So after you give 500 ml of fluid in half an hour or 15 to 20 minutes, you would expect the CVP to go up by 2 to 5 centimeters. So and you would expect the BP also to come up a little, and you would expect the pulse rate to come down. You understand? So you will assess all these after giving the fluid. Now in a good responder, what happens is the CVP will come up, the BP will come up, the pulse rate will go down, and this will be maintained. That is what we mean by a good responder. And this indicates that the bleeding has stopped, or it's very minimal. You understand? Otherwise, yeah. Then you have what are called transient response in this. Here what will happen is the CVP will come up, the BP will come up, the pulse rate will come down, but this will last only for a few minutes. After 10 or 15 minutes, again this will go down. All these things will go back to go bad again. These are transient responders. What does this indicate? This indicates that there is still ongoing bleed, moderate ongoing bleed. You understand? In the first case, responders, to me it is very minimal. You won't have to intervene immediately. Transient responders, again, you might have to intervene, but again, you have a little bit of time. And finally, you have the non-responders. Here what happens is, you are given 250 ml of blood or 500 ml of blood in 20 minutes. The CVP does not come up, the BP does not come up, the pulse rate does not go down, indicating that there is still severe ongoing bleed, where you do not have time to do other investigations or to do anything else. You have to take the patient immediately to the theater and try to find out the site of the bleed and control the bleed. Either theater or somewhere else. You have to control the bleeding immediately. There is no time for any further, investigations and all that. So this is what we mean by dynamic response to fluids. It's a very important thing, especially in the casualty department and emergency department anyway. So this is one way of assessing. Well, obviously, I told you we'll go through the clinical features, the history, and I told you about all those other age and all those things. Decision is based on many things, but this is one way of telling you whether you can wait or not. So I told you in hemorrhage, our immediate aim is to control the bleeding. Resuscitation is a part of, goes along with the control of the bleeding, but a primary aim is to control the bleeding. Acute hemorrhage, I'm talking about acute hemorrhage, all right, unlike non-surgical hemorrhage. Surgical hemorrhage, yeah. So this is one way of going about it. Yeah. So once you have decided you have to control the hemorrhage, there are various things again you have to consider, isn't it? One is you have to identify the site of the hemorrhage, which is probably the most important thing in controlling it. I'm talking here about surgical hemorrhage, all right? Please do not confuse this with non-surgical hemorrhage. Non-surgical hemorrhage is a separate entity where you have to treat the blood problem. You understand? So that we will not consider here. We are talking purely about surgical hemorrhage. So in surgical hemorrhage, obviously I told you the first thing is to identify the site of the hemorrhage. As I was telling you, if you have a cut your finger, it does not require a rocket scientist to tell you that the site of the hemorrhage is the finger, isn't it? You know where it is. Whereas, if the patient has hematemesis, you know, again, you know that there is a hemorrhage, you don't know where it is from. It is from the GI tract, but you do not know the exact site. So you have to locate that site. Or if you have concealed hemorrhage, I told you about a patient coming in after an RTA, there is hemorrhage. You know that there is hemorrhage somewhere. Why? Because the patient is pale, the pulse rate is high, the BP is coming down, and the HB is low, PCV is low. You know there is hemorrhage, but you can't see where the hemorrhage is. That is where you have to probably, again, investigate. It could be from the thorax, it could be from the peritoneum, it could be in the pelvis, it could be in the thigh. These are some of the sites where you can get massive hemorrhage, concealed hemorrhage. So you'll have to investigate that. Like that. So you have to find the site of identify the site of the hemorrhage. The other problem is you have to start resuscitating measures immediately. That is why we talk about the IV fluids and vasoconstrictors, and also you might have to give oxygen, all sorts of things you have to do. So you have to resuscitate the patient. See, all these things are carried out simultaneously. You don't wait for one to and then start the other. So while you're resuscitating, you will try to identify the hemorrhage and what type of hemorrhage it is, the site of hemorrhage, all that. Yeah. So I identify. I already told you about this. So yeah. Now there are various ways in which you can control hemorrhage. Once you have identified the site, you have to control it, isn't it? Obviously, as surgeons, you will first think of surgical, but it is not always necessary to undertake surgery for correcting a hemorrhage. There are other options like angioembolism. Like again, I was telling you about this splenic injury. Supposing it's bleeding from one vessel, probably you can angioembolize it. You understand? Which is done by the radiology department. So they block that vessel, you know, they put in a catheter into the bleeding vessel and block it. That is one way. Or an endoscopy can probably control it. Like for example, if you have a patient with hematemesis and you do an endoscopy, you find that it is esophageal varices which is bleeding. Patient is an alcoholic, he has a history of cirrhosis and he has come with hematemesis. You suspect it is, obviously the first suspicion would be esophageal varices. You do an endoscopy, you find that it is esophageal varices. You can either ligate it or you can use sclerotherapy, like that. There are various techniques which the endoscopist can do to control the bleeding. So depending upon the site and the cause, there are various options. So now it is your duty to find out where, like I told you, that is why the site of the bleeding is important. And yeah, so that's how it goes. Now, I told you finding out the site and the cause of the bleeding is a primary concern, isn't it? Besides finding out the degree of hemorrhage, which we already discussed. So how do you go about finding out the site of the hemorrhage? One is from the history. I was just now telling you, if the patient has a history of alcoholism and he has a history of cirrhosis and he's got hematemesis, the first thing or the most likely cause is esophageal varices. So the history is very important. Or, for example, patient has come with a road traffic accident and he's got a distended abdomen. His HB is dropping, BP is dropping, he's going into shock. The most likely thing is an intraperitoneal hemorrhage. And now you must know probably that is all that you can make out from the history. And then there might be some telltale signs, like for example, there might be a bruise on the left lower chest, indicating that it's probably a splenic rupture. Understand? So you have to look at the findings and, yeah. Yeah, then I told you the type of, now hematemesis, obviously it will tell you that the bleeding is from the GI tract, isn't it? Or melena, again, it tells you that the bleeding is from the GI tract. Epistaxis tells you the bleeding is from the nasal cavity or from the chest, from the lungs, you understand? So, I mean hemoptysis, I'm sorry, epistaxis from the nasal cavity, hemoptysis from the lung. So that will give you, so the type of blood or the site of the bleeding will tell you the site of the hemorrhage also, probably. Then you go for the physical findings. I already told you about contusion or a fracture of the lower ribs on the left side. And hemoperitoneum, probably it is due to a splenic rupture because the spleen is located in that region. Similarly, on the right side, it's probably from a liver trauma. You understand? Yeah. So external injuries, like I told you, fracture of the ribs or abrasions can tell you the cause for the internal bleeding. Intracavitary bleeding is often difficult to locate. Like I told you, hemothorax, difficult sometimes to locate, where we know that most common causes are this, that and all that. But the exact location sometimes may be difficult to locate. Similarly, intraperitoneal hemorrhage, like I told you, patient has come with a blunt injury of the abdomen following a road traffic accident. You know that the patient has a hemoperitoneum because he is pale and his BP is dropping, is going into pulse rate is high, abdomen is distended. But the exact site may be difficult to locate unless you do some investigation or you do an exploratory laparotomy. So sometimes to find out the cause is difficult. External injury, I told you, cut, laceration, you know exactly where it is. Or bleeding from the scalp, you know where it is. But along with this, the patient might also be having an internal injury. So it is dangerous to, in a complicated injury, like for example an RTA, it is dangerous to label the cause of bleeding as purely from the external side. You should be aware that it could also, patient could also be having an internal hemorrhage or a concealed hemorrhage. Yeah. Yeah. So once you know that there is a bleeding, I told you, provided the patient is stable, that is BP is being maintained on IV. I told you that is why we have to do that, what do you call, fluid resuscitation test. Yeah, that is why we have to do this dynamic response. If the dynamic response shows that the patient is a responder, you have time to do other investigations. Or even a transient responder. You maintain the patient's BP and vitals by giving IV fluids or blood, and you can do investigation. In a non-responder, there is no time to investigate. You have to immediately go in and try to find the site of the hemorrhage and control it. You understand? So that is what I was trying to tell you. Yeah. So once you have a bleeding, you have to do investigations to find out the site of the bleed. You can do a chest X-ray. Now, simplest investigations are X-rays. You understand? Now, I told you there are 3-4 sites where you can get concealed hemorrhage, large quantities of concealed hemorrhage. One is the thorax. The other is the abdomen. The third is the pelvis. And the fourth is the thigh. Femur, fracture of the femur. So you can take a chest X-ray to see whether there's hemorrhage. You can do a X-ray of the abdomen, or you can, pelvis again. You can take an X-ray of the pelvis if there is a pelvic fracture, and if the patient has features of hemorrhage, there is no external hemorrhage, but it's concealed hemorrhage. Most likely it is from the pelvis, like that. The other investigation that you can do is an ultrasound of the abdomen. An ultrasound again, or of the chest, it can tell you whether there is fluid. That is one other investigation that you can do. Nowadays, you have what is called FAST, which is again an ultrasound, which can be done even by a person who has minimal experience with ultrasounds, or you can have a special training in doing a FAST. An ultrasound is done by an expert sonologist or a radiologist, isn't it? But even a surgeon can be trained to do a FAST, or an emergency department personnel can be trained to do a FAST, which is focused abdominal sonology for trauma. Here what you're trying to do is, all that you're trying to do is trying to see whether there is fluid in the abdomen. And because the patient has a blunt injury of the abdomen, you think you will attribute that fluid to blood. So that is, you will say there is fluid in the abdomen, so it is most likely a hemoperitoneum. You understand? And then you will try to investigate exactly what is the cause. Besides fluid in the abdomen, you can also look for pericardial effusion, you understand, or pleural effusion. All these things can be made out by FAST. So there are certain areas that you look for. There are some technical things that you have to know. You look here in the you look in the subdiaphragmatic space, like that. I leave that, I won't go into the technicalities involved here. But basically, this is what you're trying to do. Basically, this is what you're trying to do. Yeah. The other way in which you can find out peritoneal hemorrhage, intraperitoneal hemorrhage, is by doing a peritoneal aspiration, or you can do a peritoneal lavage. Now, these are not done frequently now. This was in vogue, or it was very commonly practiced before the advent of ultrasound. Because there was no other way of finding out whether, sometimes there is no other way of finding out whether there is intraperitoneal hemorrhage. Peritoneal aspiration is, you just put in aspirate from the peritoneal cavity, and if there is blood, obviously there is intraperitoneal hemorrhage. Now there are a lot of drawbacks and all that. I won't go into the details. But nowadays these are not done. We depend upon an ultrasound of the abdomen or a FAST to find out whether there is bleeding into the peritoneal cavity. Peritoneal lavage is the same thing. You put in a cannula into the peritoneal cavity, you instill some saline, you withdraw the saline, and then so if there is even minimal hemorrhage, you might be able to detect. There will be RBCs in the aspirate. Like that. There are various factors which tells you that there is peritoneal, intraperitoneal bleeding. I told you these two are not done frequently now. We rely on a FAST. That is focused abdominal sonology in trauma. That's a full form of this thing. It's an ultrasound of the abdomen to see whether there is fluid. All right, so that will tell you. Now here I'm concentrating mainly on the abdomen. All right, a chest, you'll have to depend upon a chest X-ray, or you'll have to do a CT of the chest. Again, ultrasound can tell you again whether there is fluid in the chest. Yeah. Now, if the patient is stable, that is, if you have time, you can later on do a CT of the abdomen, or even go up to an arteriography. A CT can tell you whether there is a liver trauma, whether there is a splenic trauma, whether there is bleeding from the intestine, from the mesentery, lots of things that the CT might be able to tell you. You are doing what is called a contrast CT, all right? The contrast CT, that is, you give an IV contrast and then take the CT. This can tell you can give you a lot of information. They can tell you, and now see, trauma to the liver or to the spleen, injury to the liver and the spleen is classified depending upon the CT findings that you get. So they classify it in such a way that they can tell you whether there is an ongoing bleed, whether you have to go into the abdomen or not. So depending upon the degree of injury according to the CT scan, you will decide whether you have to open the abdomen or not. So CT is a very useful investigation. To be more specific, you can do an arteriography. When you do an arteriography, you can see the exact vessel which is bleeding. You understand? That is the whole advantage of doing. The other advantage of doing an arteriography is if it is a single vessel, or if it's something, you can embolize it. So it can also be therapeutic. So that is the advantage of arteriography. Yeah. You just think over it, 1 minute.